Hey, this is the video review of the Russian Revolution. All right, first let me tell you that the biggest problem learning about the Russian Revolution is it can be really confusing. And the reason why it's confusing is there are actually three different Russian revolutions, okay? And in fact, there's three different revolutions and a civil war, all right? However, even though they talk about there's technically three Russian revolutions, if you hear somebody just say the Russian Revolution, they are probably referring to that third revolution. The one marked on this slide is number 3, the Bolshevik Revolution. I marked it with an arrow. If you just hear somebody say the Russian Revolution, assume they're talking about this third revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the final revolution. That's the most important one. However, there are instances where the Regents has thrown in like a trick question. They've actually referred to one of the other revolutions and thrown people off. So I want to make sure, just in case, I want to go through all three of the Russian revolutions as well as the Civil War. Make sure you're familiar with the entire process, okay? So buckle up and let's go. Let's start. All right, first, to begin, we're talking about Russia right now. If you remember, Russia is a very large landmass. And even though the majority of Russia is actually located in the continent of Asia, it is considered a European power. And it is a European power actually thanks to the efforts of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, who both believed in westernization. They both captured greater land in Europe and pushed the border of Russia westward. And they were very involved in trying to westernize and modernize Russia. However, despite all of their efforts, even though Russia is considered a European power, I should also note, in addition to their efforts, also the capital of Russia was always Moscow, and Moscow is located in the western part of Russia. It actually was Moscow, and for a brief time, St. Petersburg was also the capital of Russia. Regardless, both of those cities are located in the western part of Russia, so again, that's another reason why it's considered a Western power. Anyway, even though it's a Western power, even though there were efforts made to industrialize and modernize Russia, Russia is still very far behind the other powers of Europe. It has very limited industrialization. In addition, the majority of its population is still involved in agriculture. In fact, Russia still has serfdom. People are still serfs. In the 1900s, there were still serfs in Russia. Russia had not freed their serfs. All right. So let's pick up. So the person in charge is Tsar Nicholas II. He is an absolute ruler. When you hear the word Tsar, and it can be spelled like I have it here on the slide, C-Z-A-R, it also is sometimes spelled T-S-A-R. You see it's spelled T-S-A-R or C-Z-A-R. They're both said the same way. They both mean the same thing. They both mean Tsar. They both pronounce Tsar. They both basically mean absolute ruler. Think of Tsar as like Russian for king. It actually literally translates into Caesar. Doesn't matter. Just think of it as that's Russian for king. All right, so the country is being led by Nicholas II, and the country is going through some later than the rest of Europe, but it is starting to industrialize within to a certain extent. It's starting to industrialize, and just like we saw in Britain. Next year in 11th grade, you're going to see this in America. This happens basically everywhere. When industrialization starts, the workers are going to be treated terribly, right? They're going to be working really long hours for very low pay. The conditions in the factory are dangerous. There's lots of pollution, so on and so forth. So in Russia, just like we saw in Britain, the people are going to be upset about the conditions. They're going to be upset about what they're dealing with, and they're going to start to have protests and things like that. Just like in Britain, it led to the rise of the labor union movement, right? In Russia, what happens is the workers who are very upset they stage a protest. They have a march. It's, men, women, children. It's, a very peaceful march. And they march through looking for better working conditions, all right? And what ends up happening is the Tsar responds to this march by shooting everybody, okay? He kills them. It's called Bloody Sunday. And this basically sets off the Russian Revolution of 1905. So this is the first revolution. It takes place before World War I, okay? So if you see a reference, if you ever hear somebody refer to the Russian Revolution of 1905, generally this revolution they'll always talk about with the year. If you see a year next to it, like 1905, that's this one, and it takes place before World War I, all right? And it's about working conditions. All right, so the Russian Revolution of 1905, there's only basically two important things that come out of it. First thing is it leads the Tsar to create the Dumas, all right? The Dumas are a Russian parliament. You remember from Britain, all right, that they had the parliament, and France also had a parliament. If you remember, before the French Revolution, France also has a parliament. I wonder if you guys remember what the name of the French parliament was. It was the Estates General, all right? Congratulations to you if you remember. So just like the Estates General, just like the British Parliament, the Dumas are set up to advise the king, all right? It's a group of people who are set up to advise the king. And what happens is people get elected to serve in the Dumas. Why is that important? Well, before the Dumas, there was, the country was led by an absolute leader. There were no political parties. There was no need political parties. There's nothing people could do. But after the Dumas are formed, you start to see the rise of political parties in Russia, so people can run for these spots in the Dumas, and that leads to the birth of the Bolshevik Party. And that's going to be important later. So because of the Russian Revolution of 1905, the Bolshevik Party is created. That's one thing that comes out of it. The second thing that comes out of it is the fact that the Tsar stays in power, okay? The Russian Revolution of 1905, it forms the Dumas, but other than that, the Tsar stays in power. All right. So now moving forward, all right, now we get to 1914. All right, so this is 9 years later. Tsar Nicholas II is still in power. And Russia is going to enter World War I. All right, what happens is, like I mentioned previously, Russia has very limited industrialization. And that impacts how effective Russia can be in World War I. Okay, what happens is, if you remember, when we talked about World War I, I showed you a map, right? Which had, actually, you know what? I'm going to go back here and I'm going to find it. Where is, here we go. You see the red line all the way to the right? That was the Eastern Front, okay? That was a line of trenches that was between Russia and Germany, all right? So naturally, there were many, many Russian soldiers sent to the Eastern Front to fight there. And if you remember from our lesson in World War I, life in the trenches is horrible, right? It's filthy, there's rats, a lot of people are dying, it's very hard to make an impact, and so on. What makes it worse is that for Russian soldiers, because of Russia's limited industrialization, they haven't mechanized their farms, they're not able to produce enough food to feed the soldiers and feed the people at home, so they don't have enough food, and they don't have enough weapons and artillery for their soldiers. So you would have soldiers going to the front without enough bullets, without enough guns. They're very often hungry. The soldiers, and what happens is that whatever food Russia is producing, that food is going to the soldiers. So as hungry as the soldiers are, the people at home are starving as well. So conditions in Russia are terrible. Add to that the rate at which Russian soldiers are dying. 75% of the Russian soldiers end up as casualties, all right? So that means for every 4 soldiers who get called up for war, 3 of them are going to end up to be casualties. All right, they're either going to be dead or injured or something from this war. So as you can imagine, the people at home are very, very angry. They hate this war. They want it over. They don't want any more people to die. They don't want to starve anymore. You know, they're very, very angry. All right, so this anger over World War I is what leads to a revolution in 1917. All right, and the second revolution that Russia experiences is sometimes called the March Revolution. This is the one, sometimes it actually can also be called the February Revolution, but let's call it the March Revolution. This is where the provisional government overthrows the Tsar. So this one, the Tsar loses power. Okay, the Tsar loses power and a new government steps in. And remember, the biggest mistake I think that the provisional government made was the biggest driver, the biggest reason why people were angry at the Tsar was because of all the suffering that the people were experiencing due to World War I. Well, you'll never guess what these idiots in the provisional government do. That's right, they continue fighting World War I. They do not end the war. They continue fighting World War I, all right? So naturally, the people are really angry. Just because there's a new government, they're still starving, conditions are still really bad. And so as you can see, if you take a look at number 2 versus number 3 is the Bolshevik Revolution. But if you notice, the other name for the revolution is the October Revolution. And the reason why they name it October is because it happens the same exact year as the March Revolution, all right? So between March and October, you get a brand new government. That provisional government does not even survive the year, all right? In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution takes place, and now it is Lenin and the Bolsheviks, which are the Russian communists, overthrow the provisional government. There is some discussion that Lenin had a lot of help from Germany because naturally Germany wants Russia out of the war, and that was one of the first things that Lenin does. Lenin actually, Lenin basically his chant was, what he promised the people was peace, land, and bread. Remember, I'm sure if you're my students, you heard the song, peace, land, and bread. Everybody sing peace, land, and bread. And if you're not one of my students and you're wondering why I sound like an idiot and why I'm singing, please go to my website, look for the video, download it. You'll be singing it all day. Nonetheless, he promises people peace, land, and bread. Why peace? Peace because he says, you put the Bolsheviks in charge, we are getting out of World War I. We're going to have peace. Land. What does he mean by that? Remember, like I said, Russia still has serfs. You still have this kind of feudal-like system where the landowners have lots and lots of power, where the peasants don't own land and they do all the work. He says, listen, if you bring the Bolsheviks to power, we will take the land away from the rich landowners and we will divide it up among the people. You will get land. We will have land reform, okay? Remember, they're communists. Communists don't believe in private property, so they're going to take it away and let the land be shared among the peasants. All right. So he promises peace, land, and finally he promises them bread. Why does he promise bread? Because the people are starving. Remember, I told you, the conditions because of World War I were terrible inside Russia. The people are starving. He says, bring the Bolsheviks to power and you will no longer be hungry. All right? He promises peace, land, and bread. And so the Bolshevik Revolution is successful. They overthrow the provisional government, and that's the final revolution. That's the most important one you need to know. Okay, so once Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks are in charge, remember, Bolsheviks is, that means they're communists. So let me just, if you should remember this slide from when we did the Industrial Revolution, and I told you about communism, that this was a theory from Marx and Engels. They wrote it up in their book, The Communist Manifesto. They believe in having this is one of the things, this actually wasn't part of the theory of Marx and Engels. This comes out later, but because Marx and Engels comes up with the theory of the Communist Manifesto. And in their theory, you don't even need government. Everything's going to be shared. There's no private property, so on and so forth. Russia is the first country to take the idea of communism and put it into practice. It is the first country to take the ideas of communism and put them into practice. So they create the blueprint of what a communist country will look like. And in Russia, they kind of set this idea that the economy, instead of having an economy controlled by individual business owners, all businesses are owned by the government. And so instead of having a free market, in communism you have a command economy. You have a command economy, you have central planning. Okay, command economy, central planning, because all businesses are owned by the government. All right, so let me go back here. So again, like I said, Lenin's Bolsheviks, the communists, take over Russia. With their slogan, peace, land, and bread. The country is renamed. It goes from being called Russia to now USSR. So if you hear from here on out, that piece of land should be known as USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, okay? And the country is renamed. Now, what kind of leader is Lenin? He is, you need to know, he is very brutal to his enemies. There is a secret police. If you say anything about the government, you're going to be killed. They send people off to, the prisons. It is a very brutal regime. He rules through fear, all right? Now, after the Bolsheviks take over, not many Russians are unhappy with this new government. They do not like the Bolsheviks, either because they prefer the Tsar or some of them prefer the provisional government, whatever. There's anti-Bolshevik forces, and this leads to a civil war. Okay, so after the Bolsheviks take power, there was another civil war. That is the Red Army versus the White Army. Okay, the Red Army are the Bolsheviks. The White Army are the enemies of the Bolsheviks. All right, and the Red Army is led by Trotsky. Whatever. I don't think you need to know that level of detail. But anyway, long story short, there's a civil war. Red Army wins. So the Soviet Union remains, and the Soviet Union now is a communist country, the first communist country in the world. All right, and like I said, Lenin is going to create the first communist economy. He has something called the NEP. Sometimes that comes up. The NEP is New Economic Plan. Long story short, it's mostly a communist economy with all public ownership. However, Lenin does allow for limited private ownership. So if it was like a small business, like a tiny pizza place on the corner or something, that might be privately owned. But most of the major industries and things like that are publicly owned. That's the main thing you have to know. So he has that. He sets up the Soviet Union. There's only one political party allowed in the Soviet Union. You are either a Bolshevik, member of the Communist Party, or you're gone, or you're arrested. Any enemies of the state are killed. He has a secret police, very, very brutal. And so Vladimir Lenin leads the country. When he dies, the country will be led by Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin is a very influential person in the Soviet Union and a key figure in history. So Stalin takes over after Lenin. All right, with that, I am all done with this. So our next video will be on the topic of totalitarianism and leading into World War II.